All right, welcome back, Psych Guys podcast. Got another guest with us today. We got Dr. Andrew Harmon joining us. Very relevant guest for this topic because he is a physician by day, video game connoisseur by night.
So I will start with my credentials for talking about this. So, like I was kind of telling you guys before, played football in college, which is 40 to 50 hours per week, year round, like spring, winter, summer, fall. And obviously doing all the pre-med bio stuff, classwork. Like during my junior year, we took 19 credits and 4 science labs, which I don't know how science labs worked at where you guys went. They'd be like, yeah, it's 1 credit, but it's more work than your actual class. So a lot of work. Like after football games on Saturday, I'd be up to like 2 a.m. doing homework. So never had any free time or anything. Same with spring of junior year, I was studying for the MCAT, taking like neuro, hormones, behavior, physics, all that. So again, no free time. Never like went out, never had time to hang out with friends. And like I was telling you before, I went to Seton Hall prep for high school. And I think it was harder than my college, like in terms of like coursework. So by the time college ended, I was already just completely over school. I was like, I got to do 4 more years of med school. That's not going to be great. So, but I got like an extra 40 to 50 hours a week just gifted to me from football being over once med school started. I was already had like great time management skills because I kind of needed to survive doing well in classes and doing all this football, these football things every single day. So I didn't necessarily have to study more than I was already kind of doing at college. So I just had an extra 40, 50 hours. And ever since I was a kid, I loved video games, played a lot growing up as an only child till I was like 10. All high school, played a lot of like Xbox, PlayStation. Didn't play it all in college, but once med school started, I have played an excessive amount. Like more, like I don't know if you guys see this, but like PlayStation that does like their PlayStation wrap up each year, like Spotify does.
Right.
So like from like January to January. So from January of my second year, right? Like when you're studying for your first set of boards.
Okay.
Into the first half of third year. This number's going to sound ridiculous.
I'm ready.
I'm going to preface this. I want to say I watch all like my TV shows and movies on my PlayStation.
Oh, so that also counts.
So it artificially increases
Elevated.
it.
Okay,
so it's not as insane as it sounds, but it was 1,500 hours.
1,500 hours.
For that year.
For a year.
How much of that would you estimate as video games, I guess?
Probably 2/3.
2/3, okay.
So I play an excessive amount of video games now. So I'm really excited when you guys asked me to talk about video games.
Well, I guess my first question, is it, in your opinion, an addiction?
So I did think it was, and then we had a lecture in med school about like all these addictive things and the criteria, and I met like maybe one of them. And I was
which one did you meet?
I think it was like looking forward to doing it or something.
Get out of class, go play some video games.
Yeah, but like everything else, I was like, well, I don't meet that. Or, I was like looking for things. I was like, I want to say I have an addiction to video games, but I was like, God damn it, like none of these things line up. So unfortunately, I don't. But I just have all my free time into video games.
On a weekly basis, how many hours of video games were you playing at your peak?
I mean, if I'm like not in school.
But is COVID factored into this? Because I feel like we talked a little bit about that last time, but what do you think? Because I feel like COVID doesn't count. Let's exclude COVID times because that was a weird time in everyone's life.
That's fair. I mean, like during school with like responsibilities, like now, like get out of work at like 5-ish, go to the gym. By the time I get home, eat, shower, it's like 7:30, and I'll play till like 11.
Okay.
So it's not that bad now, but like when I'm off, like I had a year off between college and med school because at Rowan we still had the hold list when I applied. So I applied like so late, like the whole class was full, so they were like, hey, you got accepted, it'll probably be the following year. So I had the year off of not having to like reapply or anything, and I would wake up at like 11, go to the gym, and then play like video games for like 12 hours like every day.
12 hours every single day.
Like I could consistently do 12
how many
hours.
days in a row can you keep that up for?
You'd be surprised. You'd be surprised. Like easily like over a week.
Over a week. Do you think that's healthy?
I mean, I go to the gym every day.
Yeah, and then, like
So-
how I define addiction is like, is it
Yeah.
interfering with your daily life? Like, is it with your jobs, with your relationships, with your ability to be a functional person in this society? And yeah, so I actually hear that, and I actually don't get too freaked out because it's like, well, you had nothing to do, and
Yeah,
you know, because I actually listened to this podcast today all about video addiction, and it was these two psychiatrists actually talking, and they were talking a lot about how like all these now that like gaming internet disorder is in the DSM, you know, the way we have to think about it is not like greater than 2 hours a day for 5 days out of 7 days a week meets criteria for gaming disorder. Like it has to be this functionality component. Maybe there's a piece of like quantifying the time, but I mean, what do you think?
I mean, I agree with that sentiment. I think video game is something that's very recent, actually, right? And it's evolved so fast.
I actually would very much disagree with that.
With what part of the statement? That
Because-
it's evolved fast, or
Well, I was
that it's
listening.
new?
Well, define new, because I'm thinking about this podcast was talking about gaming addiction and how way back in the day when like even pinball machines started, they had these kids excessively playing way too many pinball games and like stealing to get quarters to play the video games, and then so on and so forth. So when I think of new, like, are you saying in the last 10 years? Because it's like pinball has been around maybe since like, I guess I don't know.
long as shit.
Yeah,
That's
I
all
don't
time.
know. Like,
Yeah. But
long
I think
time.
the first commercial video game was released in like what 1987 or something like that. I don't know. It's probably before
we're
that.
pulling out of our ass,
Yeah,
but
it was
whatever.
probably
Yeah,
before that. But definitely within the past 100 years.
fair.
Yeah.
Fair, right? Okay. And you talked about pinball, and think about like what a pinball machine is, and you compare that to the video games that we have today. How much more addictive is video games today compared to that pinball machine? When you had that pinball machine, you already had kids acting up, you know, going crazy for these games. And today, right, there's reports of like kids stealing their parents' credit cards so they can make microtransactions in their video games. They're running up like tens of thousands of dollars in certain cases, and going rogue essentially. Is that addiction, or is that just a kid who's being a kid? I don't know. I think it's just such a new thing that it's really hard to wrap our fingers around and be exact when we're talking about video games. So think about this: like how many billions of people are there in the world? 8 billion. There's 8 billion. All right, take a guess, guys. Out of those 8 billion people in the world, how many people do you think play video games?
I'll let you guess because I can see your computer.
At least half.
At least half. Okay.
Some type of video game, whether it's phone video game, yeah.
3.23 billion gamers worldwide as of 2023. So out of the 8 billion people, that's almost half the population of the entire world now plays video games. So contrasting that to the world where that pinball machine was, I wouldn't say half the world was playing pinball at that time.
Yeah, I think that's fair. But then what this podcast was also getting into was how can you draw significant analogies between like a gambling addiction versus video game addiction? Like, I guess with video games, you're not necessarily the reward of getting the money back, but it is something that, you know, it's hitting like a dopamine receptor in our mind, right? We keep like going back and back and back and back. And part of the internet gaming disorder, I mean, I don't have the criteria in front of me. I don't know if you do, but like, isn't it like not being able to control how much money you spend on that game? Is there a piece of that? Do you know? Do you have the DSM up in front of you or whatever? But it's like we talked about that in the Fortnite episode. Remember how like, and you even mentioned it right there, kids excessively stealing parents' credit cards to spend on these games. And so what this podcast was talking a lot about how is video games just now an extension of gambling disorder? And we've had gambling. I mean, gambling's been around for who knows how long, right? Like, I mean, probably as long as humans have been existing. So I guess what are your thoughts like thinking about that?
Well, what's been your experience, Andrew? You
So,
played a lot.
Yeah, I have very strong feelings on this. So there's some companies that prey on exploiting, I think, psychiatric kind of tendencies. And I will specifically name like EA Sports, like Activision, Blizzard, kind of these places. So kind of things on like impulsivity, like maybe like ADHD, impulsively kind of doing things. Gambling addictions as a whole, and I'll kind of get into that a little bit, how they like these companies love people with like gambling addictions. even like manic tendencies for like spending money, and some anxiety of like FOMO, like fear of missing out. A lot of these companies will be like, oh, well, we have this limited time thing for only 2 days and it'll never be here ever again. So like people spending money. But so I could talk about Blizzard for a while with kind of what they do in terms of like these gambling addictions.
And these are video game companies.
Video
like
game
the,
companies,
like the Walmart and the Target of video gaming.
Yeah.
Fair to say?
June and I talk a little bit about Diablo. I don't know if Logan, if you've played Diablo.
I haven't played it, but I at least know about it.
Okay, so June, can you name the Diablo games like that you've heard of?
Well, there's just 1, 2, 3, and 4.
I was gonna go Diablo 1.
It was just numerical.
Yeah, so I would say most people think of it that way. So between Diablo 3 and 4, this was last year, I think, they came out with a mobile game, Diablo Immortal. Okay. And what this game was, like most mobile games have microtransactions. It's kind of like the Farmville, like you could pay some money to speed up, whatever. So this Diablo Immortal, in order to get a fully maxed out character, the only way to do it was through buying. And you guys are going to lose your minds on this. There were like streamers who figured out how much it cost. It was hundreds of thousands of real life dollars.
Oh, wow.
To max out one character in that game. And how they do that is, which companies started doing a couple of years ago with these like loot boxes. Where, like that's like where the gambling.
Explain loot boxes for people that don't game.
Yeah, so they'll be like, oh, you get some like currency in this game. You could buy this box and like we don't know what's in it.
Right.
It's going to be random. But like the odds are like really shitty that you're going to get something good. Like FIFA with EA does this all the time. It drives me insane. Like I don't play FIFA, but like them doing it still pisses me off. They have like this thing called Ultimate Team where like you basically get like the cards of like soccer players. Like you get like a Messi card and your team like becomes sick. Right. But each year they reset like, oh, FIFA 22 is coming out. They don't change the game at all, but they reset your ultimate team completely. So you have to start from scratch trying to get like these cards. And what they'll do is they'll have like these loot boxes and be like, there's like a random chance that you could get like this 99 overall Messi. But instead, like you get like a 60 overall like scrub. So like that's especially like kids who like have like these impulsivity issues or people with gambling addictions. Like that is where like the gambling comes in. Like, yeah, you're not getting like real life money, but like you're spending. And like what they do is they say like, oh, well, you could buy like the in-game currency with real money and then you could spin more boxes. So like that's like a really big thing that's been like happening is especially with like EA where they like, oh, well, you could spin like hundreds of boxes and you'll eventually get something good. So people with like these like gambling addictions and tendencies are like, oh, well, I'll just keep like spending money and money and money because I could do that and I'll eventually get it.
Economics of video games. It's been fascinating to see how that industry has changed even within the course of my lifetime. I remember Blizzard used to be a great company, right? They used to make like StarCraft. People used to love their games. And over time, as the video market industry has gotten bigger and bigger, I feel like these companies are becoming more and more
greedy.
Typical of what you expect from big corporations.
Or drug dealers.
Trying to exploit individuals for economic profit. Is that something that's being talked about within the video game community?
Yeah, I feel like I see a lot.
Is there any kind of pushback to that?
Yeah, no, a lot of like Blizzard is viewed as like the villain of video game.
Oh, is that right?
Like they used to be amazing. Like the Diablo 1 and 2 are like renowned games. Like they used to come out with like amazing games. And like like Diablo 4 they came out with. And it was like, oh, this is like Blizzard approved. Like we're going back to like old Diablo. And that's like why it sold so well is everyone's like infatuated with like what Blizzard used to be. And now they're just like this greedy company that another game. Have you guys ever heard of Overwatch?
Yes, I'm familiar with that.
So Overwatch 1 was out for like years. And people were like kind of getting mad because 1, they had loot boxes, which everyone hated. And 2, they weren't releasing new content. And they were like, oh, well, we're coming out with Overwatch 2. So all of our development time's going towards that. So people are like, okay, fine, we'll like accept it. So then, I forget if it was last year or 2 years ago, like sometime in that, they were like, oh, Overwatch 2's coming out. We're coming out with like PvE, which is like player versus like environment or whatever.
Okay.
All right. So it's like a co-op thing. Like you can play with your friends, go through like missions. They have like different skill trees that you could level up and make like the gameplay different for like your favorite character. And they were like, that's like going to be the main thing in like Overwatch 2. But like, we're still working on that. So we're going to release Overwatch 2, but just like the PvP, which is like the multiplayer, like Call of Duty, like style fighting. So they shut down the Overwatch 1 servers. Right, so you can't play Overwatch 1 at all. Like people spend a lot of money like getting like these skins. Like that's the main thing,
right.
Like all these cosmetics. Into Overwatch 2, they changed virtually nothing. Like all they did was, it used to be 6v6, they changed it to 5v5, and it was virtually the same. The only thing they took out were the loot boxes, and instead they made it so like the only way to get skins is to like use real money. Like there was like no in-game way to get the skins.
Mm-hmm.
So like people were like, this sucks. Like what are like, this is literally just for you to make more money.
Right.
And then like 6 months or so after the game was released, Blizzard says, actually we're scrapping the PvE mode. So that's just not going to be a thing anymore. So like they like let it be like 6 months of people like spending money, getting ready, like for like their characters for like the PvE mode, for them to be like, oh yeah, no, we've known for about a year that we're not doing this.
Wow.
And it's so just like exploiting like people for like money.
Right.
So it's like essentially like if you get somebody hooked onto your product, you can essentially sell them anything. And they're kind of screwing the player base over because there's already people that's been playing for, I don't know, like years, right?
Yeah.
And would you say they're addicted to the game if they continue to play in face of these negative changes and these predatory behaviors by these big corporations? Yeah. Is that an addiction? When you see this other party clearly taking these actions, yet you still continue to partake in that experience?
I think if they're like actively spending money and like not really able to stop, then yes. Like I know some friends who will play the game and be like, I don't care what they're doing. Like I'm not going to spend any money on it, but like I'll enjoy it for like a couple months. And like they'll just kind of put off like all these like awful things. Like Blizzard also like has been in like a whole world of like hurt with like sexual harassment stuff like in the like workplace. So like they're just like the bottom barrel, like shittiest, like whatever you could think of for a company is like what Blizzard is. But yeah, like some people will be like, yeah, I don't care about like that they're ripping people off and that they're stealing money from people and all this stuff. Like the game's like will be fun enough for like a couple weeks. I'm not gonna spend any money on it, then I'll just move on from it.
I'm gonna throw out a stat because I want people to understand how big of an economic industry video gaming is. And I want to get your thoughts on this, Logan. So in 2023, the video game market is estimated to be worth $197 billion. So for comparison, if you put together all the teams in the NFL, that combined worth is estimated to be valued at $143 billion.
Right.
So contrast that to the almost $200 billion that the video game industry is worth. That's how much economic power is, like we were talking about, when it comes to video gaming. Does that surprise you, Logan?
Well, I mean, in doing my preparation for this podcast, I ran into that similar stat actually, but it was comparing and contrasting, not necessarily video games against the NFL. I like how you did that there, but it was comparing and contrasting against the movie industry. And I wish I had the movie industry in front of me, but they were talking about how it's like, vastly bigger. So it's very interesting to think about, like, isn't it possible also that there are people in this world that are addicted to Netflix or addicted to movies? Like, isn't this all like, why are we getting so wrapped around on video game addiction? Like, addiction is addiction. Like, in a sense, like if it's movies, if it's video games, or even we could argue that substances can elicit a very similar response in the brain, right? Like a dopamine kind of chasing that we're doing, right? Like cocaine or meth is the easiest thing to think about. So I have a very interesting question I want to pose to both of you. New Jersey is not one of these states, but in 37 states allow for involuntary commitment for individuals who are in the emergency room, assuming because of substance use or it said alcohol use disorder issues. So therefore, if we're saying that a video game addiction is very analogous in a sense to any addiction to like a substance, is there going to be a world, or is there going to be situations when someone is going to be involuntarily committed based on their video game addiction? What do you think about that?
I'll go first if you want to think about that. I think at some point it will get to that, but I think at its core, video game, like obviously the difference between drugs and video games is, one, like you could be like, I only took a little bit of drugs, like it's bad for you regardless. I think video games have a lot of kind of positive mental health effects that drugs do not. Like at its core, I think video games versus like watching Netflix, if you spend like the same amount of time, like video games are more engaging. I think they're more mentally stimulating. I might just be saying that because I just
you might be biased.
I very well might be, but like it helps with a little bit. It helps with hand-eye coordination.
Sure.
It's a good socialization tool. Like I know people, like I'm like one of them. Like I've friends I've never met in person, right? And like you meet through like video games, and you could just play with them. Like it's a way of socializing without having to go out. Like I'm super introverted. I don't like find not going out and like going to like bars and stuff, but it's a way to not be by myself. Whereas like you're watching a TV show like 8 hours a day, like you're just in your bed by yourself, like not mentally stimulated. But I do think that at a certain point with how things are going, that I don't know about necessarily New Jersey, but I think some other states that you could be like involuntarily committed for like substance or alcohol. I think it could get to that, especially like when you put in like the gambling addiction and like how much money some people like spend like impulsively not being able to stop.
Right.
Like they can completely ruin their lives and like kind of their family's lives if it's like a kid through all that. So I think we're not too far off to getting to that point. I think it really has to do with like the regulations. Because like video games are not regulated at all, which is why you have like these scummy companies that just exploit people, because like the people in charge are like people who don't understand video games, like how they are. They're like, oh, I remember Pac-Man. And it's just like, okay, well, these games aren't really like Pac-Man with how much money you could spend. So I think once like kind of our generation gets into the power role of that with people who understand and grew up with kind of these video games, I think we could get to that point where people are being involuntarily committed due to video games in some sense.
Video gaming addiction causing them to be dangerous to self or others.
Yeah.
Perhaps. I actually disagree there. I don't think I can imagine a world where that sort of medical intervention is going to be recommended for excessive video game use. Because when I kind of project, like 100, 200 years out, I mean, think about what's happened within our lifetime, right? Was it 2007 when Steve Jobs introduced the first iPhone?
Probably
Something
like
that.
whenever it was, yeah.
Yeah, so before that, we weren't carrying around these phones in our pockets. But fast forward to 2023, I mean, do you go anywhere without your phone? Is it fair to say your phone is an extension of you?
Yeah.
It's essentially a part of you now.
Are we already integrated with computers?
I think we are. I think we are. I think this is
so.
the first stages. And if you look at the course of human history, I mean, first we integrated ourselves with tools, and we've subsequently we've integrated ourselves with this thing that we call society and civilization. So the story of human history is one where the only constant is change, and we're constantly evolving. So with the advent of, you hear things about like Neuralink, these brain implants, you see these like mechanical suits that people put on, and paralyzed people can control them with like signals in their brains, and they can actually walk again. They have bionic arms. The things that they're doing. I mean, the new iPhones were released today, right? So there's been a lot of talk about what Apple's working on for the future, like these glasses where it's simulated reality, and instead of phones, they're banking that's going to be the next new big technology. We're not going to carry around phones anymore. We're just going to wear these devices that's going to cover our eyes, and it's going to be a simulated reality. I mean, can that simulated reality be looked at as a video game? And with all the social ills that we have, do you think more and more people are going to retreat towards a digital world? I mean, I feel like with video gaming addiction, we're already seeing a lot of that. A lot of video gaming addiction to me is a lot of people that feel like there's no room to make progress or achieve their goals in reality, so they pursue this substitute. I mean, like you talked about it with loot boxes, right? Why are these things so attractive? It's like you open it and you can get something, and others in that video gaming world, in that digital community that you're a part of, they look at that and say, whoa, this guy is the man, right? He's got that thing that I want, but I don't have it, right? And you're elevated in your status. So who's to say that one day, like hundreds of years from now, given the rapid developmental pace of technology, that we won't live in a world that, that we're fully integrated with video games and this digital space. So in that world, right, maybe it wouldn't even be looked on as a problem. Maybe it'll just be how the world is. Maybe it'll just be part of the normal spectrum of human behavior, if you can even call that a human at that point. But I wanted to further add on to what you said, Andrew, just staying here in the here and now in 2023. So there's this idea that like, is video games good? Is it bad? A lot of arguments on both sides. And you're kind of saying, although we've accused you of bias, you're saying that there's a lot of benefits to video games. Yeah. So I actually came across this one study. So a study of nearly 2,000 children found that those who reported playing video games for 3 hours per day or more perform better on cognitive skill tests involving impulse control and working memory compared to children who have never played video games. Yeah. Is that a study that you were aware of?
I was not aware of that, but I'm not really surprised. Like I said, like just playing video games, I kind of compare it to like reading a book. Like I know this older generation has been like, you're going to rot your brain playing video games, but reading a book is so great. And I obviously completely disagree with that. Like playing a video game, it requires a tremendous amount of hand-eye coordination, like especially like certain games. And I think it is like just as mentally stimulating as reading a book. Like it's not going to help your IQ of like learning new words and being able to kind of use words in a daily conversation. But in terms of like mentally stimulating, yeah, I think especially compared to this younger generation now where they just they're on their phones the whole time, right? Or like just watching TV, watching like videos constantly. I think that being mentally stimulated will put them kind of ahead compared to like kids who are just like watching videos constantly.
Well, I told you the positives about that study. Here's the kicker. So they actually had to make a retraction to the study. And basically the retraction was to clarify that attention problems, depressive symptoms, and ADHD scores were significantly higher amongst children who played 3 hours per day or more compared to children who never played video games. So the study showed that there was some cognitive benefits, but at the same time, some negative aspects in terms of depression, ADHD, and attention issues that we necessarily wouldn't want for our kids. So I think it's always, like everything else in this world, there's some positives and there's some negatives. What do you think from having, like you self-admittedly have spent a lot of time playing video games. Do you agree that there's some negative aspects? And if so, what are some of the prominent negative aspects that you believe in?
So I think it is pretty individual specific. Like you have, like we kind of went over like all those negatives that like these video game companies are preying on, like these different tendencies people could have. I think people who do have these tendencies and start getting wrapped up into video games and have it become kind of like a big part of their life, there's going to be a lot more negatives compared to like someone like me who could play the same amount but doesn't have those like gambling tendencies or like these impulsive tendencies to like spend all this money and like let it consume my life, where I'm not going to class and can't like pass like my medical school exams and like work, like I'm not like missing work because of like video games. So I think a lot of the negatives that come along with it are pretty individual specific, like more on like the extreme end.
Yeah, we can't make a blanket statement that every person that plays video games will develop X.
Yeah.
So I get what you're saying. I'm very curious. We're talking now about, of course, pros and cons. Let's assume someone's dealing with significant cons. I'm very curious to get your guys' opinions on treatments. Before I kind of share, I would like to break this part down and how we approach this into like maybe behavioral modification versus, we're all soon to be psychiatrists, right? So I'd like to get into a little bit of medicine even. I was doing some research today. I'm sure you guys were too a little bit. Seems like, okay, first, if a person is developing or has this video game addiction, give them therapy, right? Like that's kind of, like no shit, right? CBT, family therapy, especially if this is like a pediatric case and like the family dynamics, how the video games are impacting that family, totally makes sense, okay? But how do you handle educating whether this is a pediatric patient? Let's just talk about behavior here. Do you tell them, okay, you have serious video game addiction, you need to stop. You need to take a break. You need to completely abstain, very similar like we do to alcohol use disorder, cocaine use disorder. What would you guys advise, and like how do you approach that situation for just behavior?
The behavior of the actual gaming?
Well, how to change your behavior to treat video game addiction?
To treat video game addiction. Oh, okay. Well, I think just addiction in general is a really tough situation, right? When we talk about the classical substances, I guess I'll call it that, like alcohol, cocaine, and all these other stimulants, usually the relapse rate is extremely high. Majority of people especially when it comes to alcohol use disorder, they end up relapsing. So I think we have to go into it knowing that treatment of any sort of addiction or excessive behavior is going to be a tall task. It's extremely difficult. And I don't think we, at least as the state of medicine is today, we don't have any good medication options. And everything is geared towards more therapy. And I think this would be another great case for it. Maybe if you're dealing with somebody that's significantly younger, the traditional therapy may not be as impactful. But I don't think there's a better option, at least not one that I'm aware of. And the traditional way that we do this is what we call motivational interviewing, right? We have to remind that person, okay, you're partaking in this behavior at an excessive level. Right? If you continue to spend all your time in this way, look at what it's doing to your relationships. Is that something you're okay with? Well, what are your visions for the future? What goals do you have? Do you want to have a career in whatever field? Yeah, you do. Okay, but take a look at how much time you're spending doing this activity. You're essentially choosing between video games or this beautiful future that you're envisioning for yourself. Is it worth it? Are your relationships worth it? Is your future that you envision worth it enough for you to say no to this daily habit that you have?
Well, let me push back there because I think that's kind of a little leading question in a sense. Because I think obviously the patient's going to be like, well, of course I want those things. I want that career. I want that marriage. I want whatever. But how do you get there? Do you tell that person, like what I'm trying to get at here, are we trying to go for abstain or a harm reduction? And what do you guys think is the best approach perhaps to a video game addiction? Like, dude, you need to just stop. Or is it, can you use this for, especially like a pediatric patient, right? Like after you do your homework, you get 1 hour of video game time. What do you guys think? And how would you try to advise a patient? Andrew, let's start to you first.
Yeah, so I think it's more harm reduction, especially if you're talking to a teenager or a kid and you're just like, don't play video games. They're just gonna be like, okay, boomer.
Right.
You didn't have video games growing up. We have video games now. All of my friends play video games. Why do I not play video games? So I think it's important to differentiate again, the drugs versus video game addictions, right? Any amount of drugs is not good for you.
Disagree with that statement wholeheartedly.
I'm the main drug.
Okay, so you drink alcohol, is that a bad thing, right?
I mean, inherently,
for some people it can be.
Right.
I think alcohol itself, in any obviously if you could drink socially, it's not going to harm you, but it's not good for you. There's no health benefit. It's only going to be bad.
But there's social benefits.
Right.
Yeah, there's social. I mean, there could be
there's even have been some studies that show that it helps reduce blood pressure, right? Certain studies, and maybe it's because of the stress, maybe it's because of that socialization. It's look at if we say, okay, any amount of meth is not good for you. It's okay, but isn't that kid over there on Adderall? That's my thinking.
Yeah, I mean, they're not every drug. I'm the typical drugs that you're going to see in the ED, someone who is a heroin kind of addict, right? They have this heroin, cocaine, things like that. Whereas you could be compare someone who goes on a bender for 1 or 2 days of drinking, right? Versus someone who's I'm going to play video games for 12 hours Saturday. One of them is significantly more harmful than the other, right? Health wise. Going back to the original question,
right?
I don't think it would be helpful to be you should just stop playing video games, because I do think there are
I very much agree with
a lot of benefits. I think it's figuring out what are the harmful effects of the video games. If it's their addiction is causing them to spend all this money, or they're taking their parents' credit cards, and kids up with Fortnite who spent thousands of dollars.
Right.
Being able to kind of individually tailor that treatment modality to be okay, well, how about we don't spend money, and maybe it's not the hours we're playing. I think there's different ways of video games being a problem for especially kids, I think, more than adults. In a lot of senses, being able to individualize it to being get rid of the harmful effects, oh, you're not sleeping because of this, then we could be oh, why don't we cut it off at whatever time, trying to compromise. I think especially with kids, I think it seems more realistic with.
Yeah, I like that answer a lot because, you know, what I think about a lot, especially if we think about a pediatric case, and I think this is most easy to think about like a 13-year-old boy going ham on Call of Duty or something, or Fortnite or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you take that video game away, it's just like, okay, well, I'm taking your Xbox now. Good luck. You know, there's still video games that are accessible easily on a cell phone or on a computer, the same device that person is doing homework on, or maybe like you said, Joon, this whatever iPhone glasses, whatever they look like, I imagine they'll have video games one day too. So
most def.
Right. You know, I think that abstinence, the same way that we, of course, and I do agree, in definitely most situations, if someone is dealing with alcohol use disorder, it's like, dude, you should abstain, you know. But I think most especially with video games, like I think a harm reduction model is the best approach. You know, thinking of, once again, about that pediatric case, like it would be very easy, I feel like, to think about that 13-year-old getting resentful towards the parents about taking away the video games. And then perhaps that creates a motivation of, once that person does have access to video games at their own, they're going to go wild.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I do kind of want to bring up we were talking a little bit about the pros.
Wait, hold on. Before you move on, I want to answer that question too.
Okay.
Because I sort of disagree with both of you. Well, maybe not really, because I did hear you say most of the time. For alcohol?
Sure.
Okay. So I think it's the same case with video game addiction. All right. So for example, like I'm going to use that alcohol example, right? Look, if you're a college kid and you're drinking excessively, right? Maybe we need to tell them like, hey, maybe you need to cut down a little bit. There can be arguments made that it's great for networking, for social lubrication, and just a general sense of well-being that stems from those kind of interactions. Mm-hmm. So I don't disagree that there's benefits to alcohol, but if you're like 60 years old, you've been to rehab like 7-8 times in your life, they've all been unsuccessful, you don't have your life together, you're homeless because of your alcohol use disorder. I think for that individual, I would feel very comfortable saying like, you should probably never drink alcohol ever again.
Okay, but so now apply that to video games.
So video games, like is this somebody who's using it so much that they've had, so many times that they try to quit, but they were unable to, that they're not able to go to work. The only thing that they're doing is playing this video game, and it's just a recurrent pattern. I think at a certain point, you have to just tell them like, hey, maybe none is better than some. Because if you play some, we've seen from the past that behavior can lead to excessive. Yeah, if somebody is demonstrating a pattern of behavior that says they're not able to use this thing in a responsible manner, I think after a certain amount of time, you have to get to the point where you say, hey, maybe the best idea is for you to not do it at all. What do you think about that, Logan?
Well, I mean, I don't know if comparing alcohol and video games is a perfect analogy here. Alcohol is kind of everywhere in our society, right? Like we see bars.
So video games, half the world population.
Yes, but let me expand on this. So, bars, most restaurants, not all, right? But like sporting events. But there's still a reasonable avenue in life that you can avoid these things. We kind of touched upon earlier how isn't it maybe impossible to avoid access to these video games? We all carry around cell phones now. We all carry. So, and I think, of course, like as this world continues to develop and go on, like I almost am pessimistic that you can realistically avoid video games forever. Mm-hmm. Like, because I think that there's going to be little things that like are applicable to video games. And just extrapolating a little further, like think about, we're talking about internet gaming disorder today, but like I bet eventually we'll be talking about social media use disorder, right? Or like something like, it's kind of similar, like where it's kind of like chasing that dopamine addiction hit. Mm-hmm. Look, all of us are soon going to be on job searching, right? LinkedIn, Doximity. Couldn't you argue those are social media networks? How can we realistically tell someone, no, you shouldn't use those social media networks? Or it's like, so that's, I feel like it just gets so nuanced. And so that's why I feel like it has to be, in my opinion, a harm reduction approach. We've been talking for quite some time. So I wanted to, let me see if I can, we've been talking for 40 minutes. So there's one thing I really wanted to get your guys' opinion on and just see if this makes sense, because we all prescribe here. To my knowledge, there's no medicine indicated for internet use disorder, right?
Yes.
But, you were comparing alcohol use disorder. We would not think 2 seconds, right? If someone rolled through and they were using alcohol excessively, it's like, hey, man, like maybe you could benefit from an SSRI or like So it's like, are we having that same thought process now for internet use disorder? And what these psychiatrists were talking about, I think made a lot of sense to me. You know, if this internet gaming addiction is working on addiction, and we theorize that it's maybe a dopamine pathway, perhaps some of our dopaminergic agents can actually be of most benefit here. So they were actually talking about real cases that they had. It was a child psychiatrist, and they were using bupropion.
Bupropion. Okay.
I'll get to that drug.
Naltrexone?
Yep, I'll get
Okay.
bupropion, which is also Wellbutrin, which hits on norepinephrine and dopamine, and then methylphenidate, kind of treating it very analogously to like ADHD, going after that dopamine pathway. Perhaps if that person has, this was their reasoning, perhaps if that person has enough dopamine stimulation from the medication from the doctor, they don't feel this need to necessarily chase that dopamine that they're getting from the game. That was the thought process. And they also brought up naltrexone as well, and like that works on a mu opioid receptor pathway. Kind of weird, right? We're not talking about opioids necessarily today, but we think that some of the euphoria that's generated from taking an opiate, and now it has FDA approval for alcohol use disorder, and we use it for like trichotillomania, binge eating disorder, like kind of all these other things. So they were talking about also using naltrexone, and maybe that reduces some of that euphoria craving that people get from the games. So pharmacologically, does this make sense to you guys? What do you think when I'm describing this?
I think it makes sense. I mean, when you're describing somebody who's using cocaine, for example, right? And we put that individual, like we talked about this on our ADHD and substance use disorder episodes, right? You have somebody with cocaine use disorder. We prescribe them a stimulant. And the theory is when you have untreated ADHD, that makes somebody much more likely to experience substance use disorder. And if they do, they experience it on a more severe level. But also another thought process behind that approach is substitution of that dopamine, right? You're essentially taking away that cocaine, but you're also giving a dopamine agonist, boosting that dopamine so that it kind of mimics what cocaine and other stimulants do, just not to that degree. So to me, this is just saying that we're going to replace one with another. And this other being a medication that's prescribed that isn't as debilitating as that initial substances that you were kind of tied to. So I feel the same way about this as I feel about treating substance use disorders. I mean, look, ideally, you want your loved ones, you want your family members, you want yourself not to have to take any medication, right? But when it comes to a point, and the reality is that you're so hooked on whatever it may be, video games in terms of this episode, maybe cocaine or another substance, when we're talking about what we see, in our day-to-day clinical practice, it's like, hey, isn't it better, I understand that ideally you don't want that person to take anything, but if we give them a stimulant and that helps them to not use cocaine on a daily basis, and that person can regain some semblance of normalcy, get out there into the community and start building positive momentum, right? Isn't that a much more preferable option? So yeah, I'm all for it. I mean, if there's evidence behind it, and theoretically and physiologically, it does make sense to me. So I do think it's worth trying, and I bet there's going to be a ton of research coming in that area in the upcoming years, given how much video game industry is exploding and is projected to continue to grow and grow.
Definitely.
Yeah. So we'll start off. I think I agree with kind of the basis of, if this is a dopaminergic pathway, that there are medications that could help with that. I guess the pushback I would have, especially for the pediatric population, is there's like a fine line, I think, that's very easily crossed by like parents who, like, my kid will play like 2 hours of video games a night, and they'll like want them on medication because they think they have this gaming addiction where every negative aspect of their kid is caused by video games, and they don't want to accept the fact that it's just like a teenager who is acting like a teenager. Sure. Versus like obviously a kid who skips school every day because he wants to play video games. So I think that, like, beginning medications for that, there's going to be a lot of people who are want their kids on medications because they're like, my kid plays like video games, like socially, and they don't want them playing video games. So I think that's kind of a big one, like a big kind of pushback I'd have for starting kind of that opening Pandora's box.
But I think we deal with that already. I mean, there's kids, there's parents that bring their kids in because they're acting up at home, but essentially they're only having those behavioral disturbances within the home. And when they go to school, when they go anywhere else, they're completely fine.
Exactly.
And we, at times as physicians, can feel that pressure from, especially from parents, to start a medication that we, don't really feel is necessary. And I think that's when, the art of being a physician really comes into play, right? That's when we can really shine in our role as educators. And in fact, in that case, I will tell that, I mean, according to the American Pediatric Association, the recommendation is for children that are 6 or older, it's actually 2 hours a day. Right. And we know from studies done with social media use and screen time that up to 2 hours a day is associated with a positive sense of well-being. It's really when you go over that 2-hour threshold that you start to experience a lot of these negative emotions. So I think that's I think that's situations like that is exactly as medicine becomes more and more algorithmic as we're moving forward. I think more and more that's going to be an area as educators where we can really shine.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that to an extent. The other kind of pushback I have with that is comparing it to kind of other drugs, right? Like if you take like cocaine, like I feel like that has like an actual physiologic impact on you, right? Like it's releasing other chemicals, like as a drug, right? Like playing video games doesn't do that. Like it's your own body's response, right? Like playing video games, it's like your own body reacting to that, not an outside force like increasing
endogenous versus exogenous. Yeah.
So I think starting medications that are just going to dampen that could end up being like a slippery slope. I guess you could it's akin to like a gambling addiction when like how you do that, but I mean I haven't had any gambling addiction cases this year to like compare it to, so I don't know exactly how we would go about kind of treating that in the inpatient setting. But I think treating something like with these different drugs could end up having a lot of detrimental side effects leading forward, or just like dampening this dopaminergic pathway that isn't being enhanced by any like exogenous things.
I think one thing's for sure, and we're coming up on about 50 minutes here, so maybe we can share kind of our final thoughts in the last 5 minutes or so. I agree with what you were saying a lot earlier, Joon, that, I think one thing's for sure is that it's not like this problem is diminishing, right? I think we can all agree that it's trending upwards. And one thing that I think is very fair is, I like what you talked about, the positive aspects of these video games, because it is like part of the social network, right? Like we grew up in a world of video games in a sense, but it's still so different than what these, teenagers experience today. It's embedded within the social network. And also, it seems like individuals that struggle more with social anxiety disorder tend to gravitate towards these video games. It's maybe a little bit easier to interact with someone when maybe they're playing a game together, or necessarily they're not seeing that person face to face. So now I think about like the world of kids these days that, we've all been around kids, right? Like I don't think they have the same social skills that we did when we were growing up. Maybe that's because of cell phones. Maybe that's because of the COVID pandemic and they were pulled out of school for such a great long time. I don't know. But I think that it seems like there's a lot more social anxiety issues. Ipso facto, I think there's going to be more internet gaming disorders. So I think we have to all kind of work together and try to advocate for more development of like internet gaming disorder treatment centers. Because I used to work at a treatment center, and I think I shared this on another podcast episode, like, a person who was there for marijuana use disorder, which is, once again, is still a real addiction, got like literally bullied at that facility. Like, oh, you're just here for weed, bro? Like, pussy. Like, now think about that. If someone with a video game issue shows up to one of these substance use facilities, that's still like an addiction treatment center. I feel like they're going to get bullied, unfortunately. And so I hope that we can develop treatment centers that are specific for this condition. And maybe one of the best ways to do that is you don't actually necessarily have to build anything physically. These are already individuals that know how to work the internet, obviously, pretty well. Maybe there can be some telemedicine kind of treatment centers or whatever, websites, maybe video games themselves that teach healthy habits for these people dealing with these kind of issues.
I agree with that, Logan, and I'm glad you said what you did, because I've come across patients, just who, let's say in your example of using marijuana, right? I've had patients that came up to me and said, oh, I don't really want to go to treatment because they're all, everybody else is dealing with heroin, fentanyl, and I can't really relate. So I can't imagine how somebody dealing with severe video game use would feel in that kind of environment. And I would question, like you're doing, Logan, like, is that the most therapeutic environment that we can provide for these individuals? And I would reason that the answer to that is we can always do better. Mm-hmm. Right, we can definitely do better, and I'm hopeful that as time goes on, as video games become bigger and bigger, some of those modalities will become developed. I don't have a final thought, but I just want to share something that was surprising to me as I was researching for this episode. We spent a lot of time here talking about like kids, right? So guys, I want you to close your eyes and just imagine a person playing video game. Mm-hmm. How old is that person?
Teenager.
I was going to say around my age, I guess, right? Like I feel like, I think about my dad's generation, who he's like 72 or 73 right now. He's not playing video games with his friends, not really, mm-hmm. right? Versus like there's a lot of I'm 34, there's a lot of my friends who still play video games. And so what I think is very interesting, it's like, think about when we're retired, our body's going to be broken. I feel like a lot of us might develop video game addiction. Well, I guess I should take that back. Like, would it necessarily be an addiction at that time of our life? Like, look at social isolation in the elderly. They can't get around as easily, all these issues. Are video games going to be a positive aspect in those elderly people's lives? So I'll stop ranting.
Is that person that you're picturing, is it a male or a female?
Oh, male.
Oh, yeah, me too.
Male?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Teenage boy. Yeah.
So here's the stats, okay? The average gamer is 35 years old.
Oh, wow.
Does that surprise you, Andrew? It surprised the hell out of me.
I don't think so. I think it's like, I think why I think of a teenager is just the joy of being like a teenager getting off of school and having no responsibilities versus now like working, having all these other things. Just being like, yeah, like I like playing video games. I want to play video games, but like just like the joy of being a teenager, being like no responsibilities. So it doesn't surprise
all right,
me.
let me try one more time then. What % of American gamers do you think are female?
35.
Oh, yeah, I was going to guess about the same.
48, almost half.
Yeah.
Does that surprise you?
That high it does, yeah.
Yeah, almost half. I didn't know that. So the average gamer is 48% female, 52% male, and 35 years old. Yeah, I mean, I before coming into this episode, I kind of thought that, maybe it's a result of getting my butt kicked in Call of Duty by a bunch of teenagers.
Right.
I like the average person playing video games was like 13, 14, 15.
Right.
But like the world of video gaming is evolving, right? It's evolving constantly. And here we are today where the average person is 35. They're a fully grown adult. Mm-hmm. It's not just a thing for kids. It's more and more, it's becoming a thing for everybody to enjoy. And it's going to become more and more integrated with our lives. And that's why we need to have conversations exactly like this, so that we can, while we don't have any definitive answers today, but that's how solutions come about, right? From intellectual discussions where we argue about the pros and cons. And I think we did a good job of that today.
I think we did very good. What are your last thoughts, Andrew? You were our guest of honor tonight.
So for some of the tens of thousands of people listening to this.
Yeah, hundreds, asshole.
Sorry, I must have increased since the last time I looked. So for any of them who have kids or like my kid plays video games, I just want to kind of briefly touch upon kind of those pros that like I think about when like playing video games. Obviously you have that form of escapism for people who like maybe aren't super happy with their lives or living conditions, maybe like
and that can even be therapeutic, right? Escaping reality.
Yeah, being like I have these medical conditions, but I could go and be like
Batman.
Yeah, Batman, whatever it is. I think is really important for a lot of people. I think there's a sense of accomplishment to combat some like worthlessness for people feeling kind of depressed. I know I could speak for me. Last year studying for boards again. Like it's the same monotonous thing every single day for like weeks, months on end. And you don't have a sense of accomplishment at the end of the day. You're like,
definitely,
whatever. Like I just started the same thing yesterday, doing the same thing tomorrow. Like being able to play video games and be like, I beat this game today. Like finished studying, I played video games, I progressed here, having that sense of accomplishment each day to combat the same thing over and over for a goal that's months in advance, I think is really helpful. And I think people could kind of do that on a daily basis, where battling with depression, feel like nothing they're doing in their life is like amounting to anything, but then they could go to like video games and be like, oh yeah, I beat this level, I beat this game, and have kind of that sense of accomplishment. And I talked about kind of the socialization tools, like I said, like I'm very introverted, like I don't really like talking to people, so like being able to socialize is still good for people like us, and being able to kind of do that online is super important. Like have friends that I talk to like most days, where if I was just like watching TV or whatever, even like just going to the gym, if I went to the gym like 7 hours a day, like still not really having that socialization that I think video games kind of enable people to have, or people with like social anxieties who don't want to go out, or like kind of scared of talking to people in public. Being able to still kind of have that human interaction, I think could combat a lot of kind of depression in a lot of people who, if that stems from them like not feeling like they belong somewhere. So I think more positives than negatives for the most part.
Right.
For the parents that listen to this.
Dr. Harmon, thank you so much for coming on. We appreciate you spending this time with us.
Cheers.